second online class. This is a spice box, and it'll be built from curly maple. That's what the original was built from. There's a couple of notes about curly maple. First of all, the reason it's desirable is because of the figure, and in this particular case, you can see figure from the outside of this board all the way across. It's got really nice striping on it. There's a couple things you want to look for with curly maple, though, besides just the figure. The sapwood on curly maple is the white wood, and the heartwood is the dark, kind of grayish wood. And I guess you can use it, but I would avoid the heartwood. I'd look for mostly sapwood. And when you're selecting your stock, you want to make sure that the figure, or the best stock will have figure that runs all the way across it. And so try to avoid the gray stripes down the middle. Hand plating curly maple can be a challenge. And even putting it through your planer, you're likely to get tear out that you're going to need to clean up. So I guess the modern way of doing that is, use your planer and then follow it up with a sander of some sort. I prefer hand tools, so I will still use a thickness planer oftentimes to thickness lumber, but I'll come back and clean it up with hand tools. But even hand tools on curly maple, they need to be really sharp. Sometimes a higher angle blade helps. There's a couple of different techniques. You can use a higher angle blade, you can use a toothing blade and follow it up with a scraper. But one technique that I think works pretty well, that will be a little bit more forgiving on the actual working edge of the blade, is to take paint thinner or mineral spirits and wet the board. And your shop gets to stink a little bit, but they'll basically soften up the fibers in the wood itself and really make it so that it cuts a lot nicer with your hand plane. And so you can do this and basically get rid of the tear out that you normally would encounter with your hand plane. You still need a sharp blade. You still need to have good hand planing technique. Make sure that you have your plane set up. You want fairly thin shavings. You can see this, a couple of things. One, it's thin. I can see right through it. Two, I'm not taking a very wide cut. This is probably a ½ inch wide cut at most. And it's set very thin. So I've got a camber on my blade. It's rounded from one side to the other. Very thin cut. I mean, that will give you basically a tear-out-free surface, and when you get done, it'll be beautiful. So that's the tip for working with curly maple. So start by taking the plans and getting 4 major pieces done. You want to cut your top and the 2 sides and the bottom, which will be out of pine. Cut those to size according to the plan. And on the sides especially, try to find the sections of your stock that are the most figured. So this will be one side. Down on the other end of this board, I'll use for the other side. There's a little bit less figure in the center portion of this board. I'll use that for the top. So be careful selecting the region for each of the pieces. Again, the sides will be some of the most visual. You've got these cut to length, and you've got the surfaces smooth with your smoothing plane. Make sure that before you rip them to width, that this edge is nice and smooth. If you use a joiner, there'll probably be tear out there. If you use a hand plane, there likely won't. I usually will, for me personally, I'll run this through a joiner to get a straight edge, or use a joiner plane, and then come back with my little block plane. This is a low angle block plane. And just make sure I get all the tear out taken care of. Now, for those of you who don't use a lot of hand tools, the most imperative thing is to have a sharp blade. I use water stones to sharpen these, and if you get stuck with it, you can send me a note and I'll help you through it. But when you're planing, read the grain. So the grain, I hope you can see this on the camera, but it's basically running uphill like this. And that's the way you want to orient it. You want your plane to basically be running uphill, or the grain to be oriented uphill as your plane's going. If you run your plane this way, it'll dig into the grain and you'll leave tear out with your hand plane as well. But if you orient the grain correctly, you'll be in good shape. Where you run into problems is if you have a board that's got basically uphill and downhill grain in it. On the uphill side, you'll get a nice clean cut. On the downhill side, you'll tend to get tear out. So that's a little bit trickier. If you can, when you're selecting the stock and laying these individual pieces out, choose grain that is going in one direction on the surface that you choose for your top or sides or bottom. If you can't avoid that, then the best thing to do is probably to take the plane and come from both sides. Basically always run it uphill. If you have a really sharp blade and you get really lucky, sometimes you can cut downhill without a problem. But curly maple is one of the more challenging boards to plane, so you'll have to see what works for you. You can also try the mineral spirits trick on the edge. Sometimes that will work. But get this taken care of now before you get into layout. Facing out, those will be the more visual, so I'm looking at figure and trying to decide if there's one side that's more figured than another, or if there's defects that I want to hide inside the case. And also looking at the grain orientation. If I have a lot of kind of cathedral grain, I'll typically point that up. So I've labeled now a right side and a left side, and I've got a little arrow showing up. I'll remember that throughout the course of the project. The other thing that I want to do at this point is start layout and think about layout. With these spice boxes, with any cabinet work, the two sides are mirror images of each other. And it's not uncommon to end up making two identical pieces, and then when you put them together in the case, finding out that one piece is oriented correctly and the other piece is not oriented as a mirror image but is the same orientation, so you have two rights or two lefts. And with figured wood especially, well, with any project you don't want to make that mistake, but with figured wood especially. So there's a couple of techniques. I think by labeling things, keeping in mind which way is up, which one's right and left, that helps a lot. The other thing is that when you're actually doing the layout, if you keep the two, so this is basically my left side, so this would be the front edge, and this is the front edge of the right side. When you do the layout, if you keep those two front edges together and do the layout at the same time, you'll avoid mistakes. So you basically realize that these are the two edges where the dividers end up, and run your layout, clamp the boards together, do your layout at the same time across this joint line, and when you're done you'll have mirror image pieces. To do the layout, go ahead and locate page 3 of the plans. That'll be the major dimensioning page to transfer layout marks onto the case sides. And on page 2, I just wanted to highlight, I guess, one thing, and that is that the top molding is fairly thick. I think it ends up being about 1 3/4 inches. And the top, well, basically there's a piece right here, kind of a false piece that serves to outline the door. And then the top is way on top of the piece, and so there's dead space in between. And we'll put a false drawer there, a false tray. If you use a full thickness, like 7/8 inch piece of curly maple for the top, and then a 7/8 inch piece here, that leaves you a very small dead space. So I'm going to leave the 7/8 dimensions on the plan, but I'm actually going to make the top only a 1/2 inch thick, and I'm going to also decrease the thickness on this. I'll make note of those in the cut list, make note of those on the plans as a side note. But that will give me a little bit more dead space in here so that I can at least get an 1 inch thick tray, and I think that'll be a little bit nicer. 1/2 inch on the top is plenty thick structurally, so I'm not worried about that at all. So just make note that if you want to put a hidden drawer up in the top, a hidden tray up in the top, that you might want to adjust the thicknesses a bit.